Hi, I'm Bella Perez Rubio, Puma Podcast, and you're listening to Teka Teka News. Balitang thinking, hindi breaking. In this episode,
Sabi nga, swerte namin na naka-survive kami sa Yolanda pero hindi namin sure kung makaka-survive kami sa pang-araw-araw naming gawain kasi nga mas dumodoble yung paghihirap na nararanasan namin ngayon. Hindi lang sa nasa pabahay ka nga, bahay nga yung bato nga yung bahay mo pero yung consequences niya kada araw, yung tubig, yung hanap buhay, yun talaga yung sakripisyo na parang susuungin mo kada araw.
this November marks 10 years since Super Typhoon Haiyan, locally named Yolanda, tore through eastern Visayas. Back then, the government vowed to build back better what was lost. But when we traveled to Tacloban City to speak to survivors of the deadly typhoon, we found many of them still reeling.
Ako si Marian Blanza, 34 years old, nakatira sa barangay 54-ay Magallanes.
We stumbled across Marian and her family while walking along the coastline.
The first house we're seeing, it looks like it's clearly been ravaged by, I'm guessing, a storm.
Barangay 54A on Magallanes Street is a row of mostly abandoned houses.
On top of what used to be a house, there are tiles.
Concrete skeletons clearly ravaged by Yolanda.
It's a few meters away from the sea.
One of the main objectives of the government's socialized housing program in Tacloban is to move residents away from vulnerable coastal areas. But Marian told us she moved back to her old home after just 3 years at a relocation site.
Actually, may pabahay kami sa Villa Diana. May mga din siya, may mga problema. Katulad ng medyo may pagka-substandard siya kasi tumutulo yung bubong, tapos yung pader, pag malakas yung ulan, tumatagos yung tubig sa hollow blocks. So, baha din dun sa loob ng bahay na tumatagos siya. Hindi kasi siya naka-finishing, hindi, hollow blocks lang siya. Pag 2 araw na walang tigil yung ulan, tumatagos yung tubig sa doon sa loob, tumutulo sa sahig. Ayun din, basa din yung namin, yung sahig.
Villa Diana is one of the sites built by the National Housing Authority as part of the government's Yolanda Permanent Housing Program. But the problems Marian mentioned aren't even the worst ones.
Walang tubig. Ang problema doon, mas malaki yung problema doon pag summer. Kasi walang nagde-deliver ng tubig. Yung nagpapaalog lang kami, G's isang container, magbabayad pa sa tricycle driver. So yung 100 mo, 10 tiner lang yun, babayaran mo pa ng 50 pesos. Tubig lang yun. Mahirap. Tapos yung pag-deliver doon ng tubig, hindi araw-araw. Siguro every 2 days. So kailangan mo talaga magtipid. Laking tulong sa amin yung pag maulan.
We went to Villa Diana. It's a subdivision of tightly packed, mostly gray, single-story concrete houses. And all the residents we spoke to told us the same thing. They've had no running water since they moved in 2016. When we spoke to the NHA, they said that ensuring access to running water in these housing units is the local government's responsibility. The rising cost of transportation was also brought up by the residents we spoke to in Tacloban. Like Marian, many of them told us it's been eating away at their already meager salaries.
Bali yung asawa ko nagtatrabaho dito sa downtown, sa Leyte Home Depot. Tapos ako nagtatrabaho ko sa Robinson Department Store. Kaya lang, ang lugi kasi kami sa pamasahe. Kung mamamasahe kami kada araw, yung trabaho namin, parang dun lang kami naglalaro lang kami. Kaya sabi namin, hindi pa naman ginigiba dito kasi private property ito. Sa tita ko to.
And while moving back to their old home has helped them save some money, it's far from ideal.
Pag maulan, malakas yung hangin, nandyan na yung parang trauma na nanginginig na ako. Pero sinasabi ko na kaya ko. Pero kung may mga kabataan naman ako ulit, So pag alam kong hindi na maganda yung lagay, bumabalik kami doon sa pabahay. Bali doon kami sumisilong pansamantala para ligtas naman. Kasi ang ano dito yung dagat eh. Ayoko na maulit yun. Masakit sa ano.
The trauma runs deep. When Yolanda struck in 2013, Marian lost her first child.
5 years old, babae. Panganay ko. Ano na sana siya ngayon? 13. Ano pangalan? Mikaela.
Micaela was Marian's only child at the time. She now has 2 more boys. Marian also lost her sister and her uncle to the typhoon. But life has been so hard since then that she's decided to move back to the coast. Back into the same house where she lost so much nearly a decade ago.
Oo, kasi sabi nga sa taong gipit, kakapit kahit na mahirap, kahit nandyan na yung trauma, yung phobia, baga lulunukin ko na lang yun kaysa naman mahirapan kami doon kasi mahirap talaga doon.
We'll pause here, but when we return, more on the Yolanda Permanent Housing Program in Tacloban. Earlier, you might have caught Marian using the term substandard to describe her Villa Diana home. It's a term that's plagued the Yolanda Permanent Housing Program for years now. Even Tacloban City Mayor Alfred Romualdez has said that 70% of the houses turned over by the NHA are substandard.
Pwede 70 to 75% substandard. Sana po dahil nakita po niya na substandard, sana po may ginagawa yung local government unit kasi after the construction, ini-turn over sa kanila.
That's Professor Lady Lynn Mangada, a professor at UP Tacloban who researches disaster recovery. She's published several studies on the Yolanda rehabilitation effort. So what makes these houses substandard?
Puno na po yung septic tank, tapos yung ceiling, tumutulo na po, tapos yung iba, nakikita po na ang ginamit na pang-walling, hindi po steel bar, kundi kahoy lang. Yung iba naman, wala talaga. So, may nag-crack-crack talaga.
And then, as you heard Marian mention, there's the issue of location.
As a livelihood, yun po yung napaka-sad talaga dahil karamihan po ng at transfer doon, yung livelihood nila related sa dagat, sa fishing. And so, nag-adjust talaga sila ng gusto.
It's worth noting that these homes, provided by the government, have at least kept residents safe from the storms that have struck since Yolanda. But then again, the shortcomings are undeniable, especially when compared to the housing provided by the private sector.
Kung ang pag-uusapan is about housing na sponsored by professional organizations, development organization, corporation, medyo maganda. Sabi nga nila, durable daw. Pero pag government housing, problematic tayo kasi di pa nga the third year, may nagre-reklamo na napuno na
And
po
so
yung
we also
septic
visited
tank.
several villages funded by the private sector. Generally, houses were bigger
There's a library.
It feels like a village.
and further apart compared to the ones built by the NHA.
It feels very alive.
They also just felt and looked more like communities. These relocation sites had homeowner associations, playgrounds, and daycare centers, to name a few. One of them was Pope Francis Village, which was built with the help of donors led by the Catholic Church. There, we met Nili Alona, a 52-year-old resident and employee of the village.
So kami ay galing sa coastal area ng Magallanes. O nang pagkatapos ng Yolanda, yung sa amin yung nag-organize UPE, Urban Poor Associate. Kaya kami napunta dito. Magallanes, Barangay 56 Desi sa seaside.
That's right. She was originally from the same area as Marian. But unlike her, Nelia never felt the need to move back.
Okay naman kasi hindi na kami natatakot, umulan man or may bagyo kasi safety na kami. So hindi na ako nag-aalala. O masasabi ko maayos yung pabahay namin kasi isa din ako na tumulong dito, portiser kasi ako. So yung naggawa ng mga bahay namin, mga beneficiary namin, tulong-tulong. Kaya masasabi ko na pinakamaganda ito na pabahay namin.
We spoke to several Yolanda survivors in the 3 days we spent in Tacloban. The sad truth is this: only the residents living in privately funded housing felt that they had managed to build back better after Yolanda. But we also spoke to Constancio Antiñero. He's the National Housing Authority's regional manager for Eastern Visayas. And he told us there's a simple reason that the quality of government housing doesn't measure up to the private sector.
We have the limited sources because implementation of the Yolanda Permanent Housing Program is under the socialized housing program of the government. So the very first that we implemented is a package of 290,000. That's a house and lot package. So more or less the 290,000 is we have the specifications and we have our own standard. So meaning to say the standard is not as comparable to the private sectors because what you can expect the 290,000 house and lot package. So the mayor said that's substandard yung implementation ng NHA. It's not really substandard. We are just following the approved specification duly approved by the Department of Public Works and Highways as resilient houses.
Engineer Antiñero says the estimated cost of a privately funded housing project is around 500,000 pesos. He also said that the houses turned over by the NHA are meant to be starter housing units that beneficiaries can improve on. But as you heard, many of the beneficiaries are just scraping by. And the situation is so dire for people like Marian that they have chosen to forgo government housing altogether. Here she is with the final word.
Siguro sabi ko nga, kung may sapat lang doon na tubig tapos maganda naman yung kalagayan namin, hindi na kami babalik sa dati naming 'di ba? Yung may masamang alaala na nangyari sa amin. Kasi sinong gustong bumalik dito? Kaya yun sabi ko nga, kung kung maayos na, pero kung ganyang wala pa ring improvement, babalita na walang tubig, walang dito na lang muna kami, at least malapit lang kami dito sa sa pinagtatrabahuan namin.
And that was today's episode of Teka Teka News. Again, I'm Bella Perez Rubio. This episode was produced by Kat Ventura and edited by Carl Sayat. Stay tuned for our Teka Teka Explains episode next week. We'll take you deeper into Tacloban and the unfinished business of rebuilding post-Yolanda. If you like this episode, share it with a friend or two. And don't forget to follow Teka Teka News and Puma Podcast wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks for listening.